The studio was filled with Ellen's trademark energy as she moved through the audience during her favorite Getting to Know You segment. But when 72-year-old Margaret O'Sullivan slowly stood up from her third-row seat, clutching her purse with trembling hands, everything was about to change. It was supposed to be a light-hearted Friday afternoon at Warner Brothers studio. The Ellen DeGeneres show was in the middle of its audience interaction segment, with Ellen wearing her signature blue suit, chatting with viewers about their lives, dreams, and funny stories that always made for great television moments. Margaret O'Sullivan sat quietly in the third row, wearing a simple navy dress and pearls that had belonged to her mother. She had silver hair neatly styled and kind blue eyes that held decades of secrets and pain behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 72, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping her deepest truths buried. During the commercial break, Ellen had noticed Margaret's intense focus, the way she seemed to be gathering courage for something important. There was something about the elderly woman's careful composure that suggested she had come here with a specific purpose beyond entertainment. Margaret had traveled alone from Phoenix, spending her modest savings on this trip for reasons she hadn't fully explained to anyone. The audience interaction segment had been typical Ellen magic, with stories about grandchildren, retirement adventures, and lifelong dreams being fulfilled. Ellen was in her element, moving between audience members with her natural warmth and ability to make everyone feel special. She had just finished talking to a woman about her new business when Margaret raised her hand. "Ellen," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her obvious nervousness, "may I share something with you?" Ellen immediately noticed the gravity in Margaret's tone and the way other audience members turned to look at this dignified older woman. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your heart?" Margaret stood up slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the back of the seat in front of her. "I have a secret that I've kept for 54 years, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I'm 72 years old now, and I'm afraid I'm going to die before I can make it right." The casual chatter in the studio died away, as everyone sensed they were about to hear something profound. Ellen walked closer to Margaret, her entertainer instincts immediately recognizing that this was no ordinary audience interaction. "Tell me, Margaret, what secret have you been carrying?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "When I was 18 years old, I gave birth to a baby boy," she said, the words seeming to physically pain her to speak. "And I gave him away because I thought it was the only way to give him a good life." Ellen stopped walking, her hand going to her heart as the weight of Margaret's confession hit her. The studio fell into complete silence, 300 people holding their breath as they realized they were witnessing something sacred and heartbreaking. "Oh, Margaret," Ellen whispered, and her voice carried across the silent studio. "It was 1970, Margaret continued, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I was unmarried, my family disowned me, and I had no money, no job, no way to take care of a baby. The social worker told me that giving him to a good family was the most loving thing I could do." Ellen's eyes filled with tears as she imagined this young woman facing such an impossible choice alone. Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper as she continued. "My father called me a disgrace and told me never to come home. My mother cried but said she couldn't go against my father's wishes." Ellen felt her heart breaking as she understood the complete abandonment this young woman had faced at her most vulnerable moment. "I lived in a home for unwed mothers for 6 months, Margaret added, her voice trembling with the memory. "We weren't allowed to talk about our babies or make plans to keep them. They told us we were being selfish if we even considered it." Ellen's expression grew increasingly pained as she realized the systematic pressure Margaret had faced. "I held him for 1 hour after he was born," Margaret said, her voice breaking. 1 hour to memorize his face, his little hands, the way he looked at me like he knew I was his mother. Then I signed the papers and watched them take him away." The studio was so quiet that Margaret's soft sobs seemed to echo off the walls. Ellen immediately signaled to her production team to stop any background music or distractions. "Margaret," she said gently, now standing directly in front of the elderly woman, "what was your baby's name?" Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small worn piece of paper. "Michael James O'Sullivan," Margaret said, reading from the faded hospital document. "Born March 15, 1970, at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen." She looked up at Ellen with eyes full of regret and longing that had been building for more than 5 decades. Margaret pulled out another item from her purse, a small hospital bracelet she'd kept all these years. "This was the only thing they let me keep," she said, holding up the tiny plastic band with Baby Boy O'Sullivan printed on it. "I've carried it with me every day for 54 years. "And you've never seen him since?" Ellen asked, though she already knew the answer from the pain etched on Margaret's face. Margaret shook her head, clutching the hospital paper like a lifeline to her lost child. "I've thought about him every single day for 54 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every major holiday. I used to bake a cake every year on his birthday and eat it alone," Margaret added, her voice filled with decades of solitary grief. "I would light 18 candles the first year, 19 the next, and so on. I still do it even now." Ellen wiped her own eyes as she imagined this ritual of love and loss repeated year after year. "Margaret, why are you telling me this now?" Ellen asked gently, sensing there was more to this story. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked directly at Ellen with a determination that belied her fragile appearance. "Because I'm dying, Ellen. I have cancer, and the doctors say I might have 6 months left." The words hit the studio like a physical blow, and several audience members gasped audibly. Ellen felt her own tears beginning to flow as she understood the urgency behind Margaret's confession. "And you want to find Michael before—" Ellen couldn't finish the sentence. "I want to tell him that giving him away was the hardest thing I ever did, but that I thought about him every day," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with purpose. "I want him to know that I loved him enough to give him a chance at a life I couldn't provide, and I want to apologize for not being brave enough to keep him." Ellen made a decision that would define this moment and potentially change 2 lives forever. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying a determination that every viewer would recognize, "we're going to find Michael, right here, right now. We're going to bring your son home." The audience erupted in applause, but Ellen wasn't finished. "Stop everything," Ellen called to her production team, her voice carrying across the studio with absolute authority. "Cancel the rest of the show. We have something more important to do today." She pulled out her phone and began making calls right there on stage. Within minutes, Ellen had her team contacting private investigators, adoption agencies, and genealogy experts. "Margaret," Ellen said, still holding her phone, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the adoption. Every detail could help us find Michael." Margaret nodded eagerly, pulling out a small notebook she'd been carrying. "The adoption was handled by Catholic Charities in Phoenix," Margaret said, reading from her careful notes. "The social worker's name was Sister Patricia Manning. I remember the adoptive family was described as financially stable, with a strong desire for children." Ellen was writing everything down, her team already working behind the scenes. "I know it was a closed adoption," Margaret continued, "but I used to drive by the agency every year on his birthday, hoping somehow I'd see him. I never did, but I never stopped hoping." Ellen's heart broke a little more with each detail of this woman's decades-long vigil. Ellen's genealogy expert called back within 20 minutes with preliminary information. "Margaret," Ellen said, her voice trembling with excitement, "we found records of your son. His adoptive name is Michael James Patterson, and he lives in Scottsdale, Arizona." Margaret's knees buckled, and Ellen immediately helped her sit down. "He's 54 years old, married with 3 children, and he works as a teacher," Ellen continued, reading from the information her team had gathered. "And Margaret, according to public records, he's been looking for you too. He registered with adoption reunion websites 15 years ago." Margaret sobbed with relief and joy. Ellen made another call, this time directly to Michael Patterson. "Is this Michael Patterson, born March 15, 1970 in Phoenix?" Ellen asked when he answered. After a moment of stunned silence, Michael confirmed his identity, and Ellen put the call on speaker for the entire studio to hear. "Michael, my name is Ellen DeGeneres, and I'm here with someone who has been looking for you for 54 years, Ellen said into the phone. "Your birth mother, Margaret O'Sullivan, is sitting right here beside me, and she has something to tell you." The studio held its collective breath. "Mom?" came Michael's voice through the phone, broken with emotion. "Is it really you?" Margaret leaned toward the phone, tears streaming down her face as she heard her son's voice for the first time since he was a baby. "Yes, Michael. It's me. It's your mother. What followed was the most emotional conversation Ellen's studio had ever witnessed. Michael told Margaret he had wonderful adoptive parents, who had always been honest about his adoption and supported his desire to find her. Margaret told Michael about the daily candles she lit on his birthday, and the letters she'd written but never sent. "I need to see you," Michael said through the phone. "I can be there in 2 hours. I've been waiting my whole life for this moment." Ellen looked at Margaret, whose face was glowing with a joy that seemed to erase decades of pain and regret. True to his word, Michael Patterson arrived at the studio exactly 2 hours later. Ellen had kept the audience waiting, turning the show into an unprecedented live reunion special. When the studio doors opened and a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair walked in, Margaret stood up on shaking legs. "Michael," she whispered, and he crossed the studio in quick strides to reach her. The embrace that followed was 54 years in the making, and there wasn't a dry eye in the studio as mother and son held each other for the first time since he was hours old. Ellen watched through her own tears, understanding she had just facilitated a miracle. "I forgive you," Michael whispered into his mother's ear, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "You gave me to parents who loved me completely, and you did the best you could with what you had. Thank you for being brave enough to give me life." Margaret sobbed against her son's shoulder, years of guilt finally beginning to lift. Ellen invited Michael's wife and children to join them, creating an instant extended family reunion on her stage. Michael's adoptive parents, who were still alive and supportive of the reunion, called in to thank Margaret for the incredible gift she had given them. The studio became a celebration of love, forgiveness, and the power of never giving up hope. But Ellen had one more surprise for this reunited family. "Margaret, you mentioned you have cancer and limited time," Ellen said gently. "Michael, your mother needs the best care available, and she's going to get it. My foundation is covering all her medical expenses, and we're connecting her with the top oncologists in the country." Ellen also announced that she was establishing the Margaret's Hope Foundation to help other birth mothers and adoptees find each other. "What happened here today shouldn't take 54 years, Ellen said. "Every family deserves the chance to heal, to forgive, and to love again." The audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. 6 months later, Margaret's cancer went into remission, something her doctors attributed partly to what they called the healing power of joy and purpose. She moved to Scottsdale to be near Michael and his family, finally experiencing the grandmother role she'd never dared to dream possible. Michael took early retirement to spend more time with his birth mother, helping her write the letters she'd always wanted to send and creating photo albums of the life they'd missed together. Their relationship became a testament to the power of forgiveness and the understanding that love transcends time and circumstance. The Margaret's Hope Foundation has since reunited over 200 families, providing resources, counseling, and support for birth parents and adoptees seeking connection. Ellen kept Margaret's hospital paper framed in her office as a reminder that some stories take decades to reach their happy ending, but they're worth the wait. Margaret lived 3 more years, long enough to see her grandchildren graduate high school and to dance at her grandson's wedding. She spent those years not mourning the time lost, but celebrating the time found, proving that love doesn't expire and hope never ages. The lesson Margaret taught Ellen and millions of viewers transcended adoption and family reunion. It was about the courage to speak truth after decades of silence, the power of forgiveness to heal generational wounds, and the understanding that it's never too late to come home. Michael keeps the worn hospital paper his mother carried for 54 years, but now it's accompanied by thousands of photos, memories, and moments they created together. He often says the greatest gift his birth mother gave him wasn't life itself, but the lesson that love worth having is love worth waiting for. Because that's what love looks like when it transcends time and circumstance. That's what forgiveness sounds like when it heals decades of pain. And that's what happens when a 72-year-old woman finds the courage to speak her truth and discovers that the greatest reunions are worth waiting a lifetime to experience. Today, Margaret's small apartment in Scottsdale is filled with photos of birthday parties she finally got to attend, graduations she was there to witness, and quiet moments of simply being a grandmother to children she thought she'd never meet. The worn hospital bracelet that once symbolized her deepest pain now sits in a shadow box next to pictures of Michael's wedding, a reminder that some journeys take 54 years but arrive exactly when they're meant to. Ellen still keeps Margaret's original adoption papers on her desk, not as a memento of a television moment, but as proof that the most powerful stories are written by ordinary people who find extraordinary courage in their final chapters. Every time Ellen sees them, she's reminded that her show was never really about entertainment. It was about creating space for miracles to unfold when people are brave enough to speak their deepest truths. And sometimes, late at night when the studio lights are dim and the audience has gone home, Ellen stands on that same stage where Margaret found her voice and changed two lives forever, understanding that television's greatest power isn't in making people laugh or cry, but in witnessing the moment when love finally finds its way home. Because that's what happens when a 72-year-old woman teaches the world that it's never too late to say I love you, and that the most beautiful reunions are worth waiting a lifetime to experience.